Well, you know, Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be Americans. I mean, I'm saying this to you who know more about this than certainly than I do. And now I think the French have gone on knowing, to some extent, though they are very deeply influenced by technique and by great corporations, I think the French have gone on knowing why they are not Americans. I think it's very hard for English-speaking Canadians.
Do you think the rest of us would have a better chance or a poorer chance of surviving if we didn't have French Canada?
Well, I don't think we'd have a chance at all. I mean, it is inconceivable to me to have Canada without French Canada. Do you know what I mean? These people who talk about being Canadian nationalists and then are hostile to French Canada, I just don't even know what they're talking about. I just literally don't know what they're talking about.
Do you think in the French-Canadian case it was the continued strength and importance of their religious values?
I don't like the word value. I think of their religion and of their speech. Now they've largely given up their religion, you know, or at least they've given up a very ancient and very remarkable religion for a rather cheap one at the moment, I think. But they've, and what is going to happen to them without that religion is very hard to say. You know, I'm not, I don't know, you know, I don't know enough. You know much more about French Canada than I do, much more. But I don't see much hope in this kind of sort of Marxist French nationalism. I don't think they're going to build in Quebec and a society that keeps itself different from the United States in that way. I just don't see any hope in that.
In other words, where some French-Canadian nationalists these days would say that they are modernizing their society and building a new and different society in North America, in your terms, they're really becoming more like the rest of us.
Yes, I would think so. In
the very sense of modernization.
Yes, in many ways. In many ways. You know, the possibility of building on, you know, that English-speaking Canadians were going to be different from this great, enormous empire down to the south. You know, it may have been an impossible hope from the very beginning. And, mind you, I think one thing that is very hard, and people have been brought up in liberalism find it very hard, I think it is much harder to resist a capitalist empire than a communist empire.
People talk about something that as this kind of society we live in these days, as a technological society. And it seems to me that when that term is used, it means, in effect, that the world is full of machinery and technology and so on. But when you use the term technological society, you mean something much more all-encompassing than that, don't you? In fact, you don't use the word technological society. You use the term, you used it a moment ago, you use the term technique.
Yes, well, I think technological is just, it was a neologism invented in the United States in the 1850s. And it's like, you know, you wouldn't talk about life as biology. You know, biology is the study of life. Well, technology is the study of technique. That's why I like the word technique better.
Technique is not all that machinery out there, but technique is the way that man thinks about his world.
Yes, you know, I think just the fact that science looks at the world as object means it looks at the world in a particular way. It relates to the world in a particular way. I know people are always saying that, you know, I mean, this is the simplest level. People are saying, you know, that all the little inventions of technique don't influence, you know, or can be used one way or another. The automobile doesn't impose on us the ways it should be used. But I mean, for instance, the automobile has you know, we can use it, but it has entirely shaped us, you know, in a certain sense. It has entirely shaped the history of this country, for instance. You know, I mean, when you take an automobile which is the same, which we needed, you see, in a certain sense, I mean, it shapes us And in that sense, you see certain things and not other things. You know, and it's this is why I so greatly admire a philosopher who's not much admired in the English-speaking world, but I think was a very great philosopher, Nietzsche. I think he saw, this early with enormous clarity, that modern science was an amazing theoretical and practical achievement, but he saw at the same time he utterly accepted it, and yet saw how killing it was to men at a certain point.
One of the aspects of modern technological society, or the impact of technique on modern society, as I understand it from your writing, is the creation of an increasingly homogeneous world.
Yes, yes.
That all cultural or national differentiations are being wiped out.
Of course.
Is this one of the consequences of technique, that it makes everything uniform?
In terms of modern science, it sees the world entirely as object. And the world as object is the same one place as another. You know, we find this with all this question about Canada and universities. I mean, you can never get chemists to see any of the point, because chemistry is the same wherever it is done.
You mean the question of whether Canadian universities should be different from American or some other? Yes,
right. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the point is that at the heart of science is summoning forth things to stand before them to give their reasons, that is, to be objects for them. And objects are the same everywhere. Now, in that sense, scientific society led to homogenization. But I think also modern moral philosophy believed, and it was a rather fine, a fine belief, that the end of history was to build the universal society of free and equal men. And that it was all these local differences that had caused wars and everything like that. I think this was, I think modern liberalism went directly with modern science. You know, they came out of the same spirit and they went together. Now the question remains whether this universal society of free and equal men, if that as a goal of human striving does not lead directly to tyranny. That is the question. You know, whether the consequence of this extreme homogenization is not tyranny.
Some kind of general tyranny of the developed world? Or?
What tyranny will be like when it has enormous technical weapons is very hard to say, but I mean, we are clearly moving towards it in a rather sort of series of great imperial powers at the moment who control within certain areas. And now, I don't think tyranny is I think one of the strange things about modern tyranny is it's not going to appear often very nasty. You know, it's not going to be a wild, crazy, romantic tyranny like, romantic is the nasty word, like National Socialism. The word education meant leading out, leading out. It was Plato's word. It was leading out from the shadows and imaginings to the eternal order. Now, practically nobody believes there is an eternal order. Therefore, what is to be known but organizing within? Therefore, the universities become sort of corporations for organizing the technical society. I think, therefore, the first step is to see the lack in modern society, to be able to look at the past. Now, I certainly find with a lot of youngsters, they are more willing to, but this is a prodigious activity to understand how we came to where we are.
And all of this rather puzzles me, George, because here you are, the Canadian nationalist on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, you're saying the questions which really interest me are universal questions and not really in any profound sense Canadian questions at all. They're Canadian only insofar as they're part of universal questions.
But, if the greatest question is, how can man be at home? If technological society makes a homeless world, and the great question is how one can be in any sense at home in the world, then one is always at home in the world in a particular place. Do you know what I mean? And what particular, you know, the status of particularity is a universal question, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a
Yes.
sort of a smart-ass way of answering it in a certain sense. But you see what I mean? I mean, I think the great question is, you know, what Nietzsche calls the death of God went with the death of people having any home. You know, one goes into, one eats and sleeps and fornicates in motels, you know, just anywhere, and they're all the same in North America. Why does one feel, or one move from suburb to suburb, why is one at home, etc., 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 etc. I mean, the question of how people can live in this kind of universalized world, you know, is in other words, how you can move back to be a being at home, having passed through the most extreme homelessness, seems to me a universal question, that's what I'm saying. But it affects me, and I'm not only a philosopher, I'm also a father, and so, you know, it affects me in terms of what they're doing to Dundas, Ontario, those highway ministers, you know what I mean, or what they're doing to Nova Scotia, you know, and all this kind of thing.
So it's a problem of rootlessness.
Yes.
Problem of alienation in the contemporary jargon.
Yes.
Well, the Marxist explanation of this is that it's capitalism that creates alienation. Now, I gather from your writings that while you have a considerable admiration for Marx and a considerable disdain for the modern capitalist system, you're not a Marxist.
No, certainly not.
Why not?
Well, I think on the question of this, you know, on the one side, you know, the two great public systems in the world are Marxism and American liberalism. And there's some, and there, you know, at a certain level, the ideological battle seems between those two. And the American liberalism say, well, we have it, the universal world will come in best through liberalism. And the Marxists say it will come best through the Marxist. But I think behind them both, what distinguishes them is not nearly as great as what unites them. The belief in the building of the universal and homogeneous society through the conquest of human and non-human nature, through science. I mean, American liberalism and Marxism are very close in some ways.
So you see,
and I would see them as products of modernity, public products of modernity, but modernity not at its height.